We're here today in West Townsend, which is in central Massachusetts, just south of New Hampshire. We're here today with John Delaney. John will tell us all about what they're doing. John, you may have seen John on Antique Roadshow. You may have seen him in some of the big antique shows over the years. John, why don't you tell us a little bit about the business?
Delaney Antique Clocks is a family business. We've been in business 50 years, just over 50 years. I am the second generation of that business. I have a brother, Sean, who's also in business with me. Over those years, we have amassed the largest collection of American tall clocks in the country, and they are here on display in West Townsend. We invite you to visit sometime.
Okay. John, before we get into some of the specifics of some of the clocks, could you run a quick rundown on the 18th century progression of clock development?
Sure, yeah. The beginning of clock collecting or clock buying for the public really starts in New England prior to the American Revolution. Prior to that time, there were very few clockmakers here in this country. Most of what was being produced in Europe, and certainly from the New England standpoint in the London area. Most of the clockmakers that were here at that time were English or European trained, and it's not until after the Revolution that you start to see a lot of American-born clockmakers coming into their own light. When we talk about American clocks, certainly colonial clocks, you have to mention the Willard family. They were the driving force in not only producing clocks, but changing the way that clocks were being manufactured and sold in this country. And there's certainly pockets of or regions where other clockmakers were very successful. In the North Shore, we have David Wood. He was a prolific maker. And then the South Shore, Massachusetts, certainly the Bailey family, John Bailey. Up in Maine, there are some pockets where you have the Frederick Wingate and Benjamin Swan, who made a fair number of clocks. And then in Connecticut, certainly Daniel Burnap was probably the most prolific maker of tall case clocks. As our country develops, there's a need for a smaller, less expensive version of a clock. The Willards flew around with a shelf clock for a little while, but it's really Eli Terry and mass production that changes the way that clocks are made forever. And the age of manufacturing clocks by hand changes so that now they're being produced in factories. And they compete on price more so than competing on just selling regionally. And those clocks are peddled all around the eastern seaboard.
If you've been to the DeWitt Wallace Museum, there's going to be a new clock, tall case clock display, and one of the clocks is going to be one of the Bailey clocks. John mentioned John Bailey earlier. Maybe we can see some examples of some of the shelf clocks and some of the other clocks you've mentioned, John.
Okay, so this is your standard tall case clock. The form or the case presentation will vary from region to region, and fortunately we can, after looking at many clocks, we can get a pretty good idea of where a clock was made based on what the case looks like. This particular clock would have been made in East Windsor, Connecticut, and this is a Benjamin Cheney, but it has some very early features. So these are pre-revolutionary features. Some things that will clue you to being an early clock is, first of all, it has a brass-made dial. Brass-made dials in this country fall out of favor just after the Revolution. Painted dials introduced in England in the 1770s, but it doesn't really affect what's going on here in America until after the Revolution. So if you see a brass dial on an American clock, you can be pretty sure that it's most likely a pre-revolutionary clock. And this has a lot of Queen Anne features in terms of its case presentation, where the bonnet columns are applied to the bonnet door. They're not separated like on this example here. And we have this caddy top or sarcophagus top. Much earlier case form. The development of that, or the evolution of that, turns into what we consider the Roxbury case. And this is very similar to what was being produced in Boston in 1785 up until probably 1805. It changes a little bit after that. But here we have the basic Willard design, although this is not a Willard, but this has a lot of the characteristics where you have these OG bracket feet, you have a very nicely proportioned case where the base and the waist and the hood of the clock hang together very, very nicely. And then you have some brass used as a decoration. And of course, by this time period, the painted dial becomes the most popular dial. And there's a couple of reasons for it. Brass dials are thought to be very expensive. Brass was the most expensive component or material in manufacturing the clock, and as a result there was always a push to sort of get away from that. And also brass dials are difficult to read from across the room, particularly in a room that's lit by candlelight. They can be quite a challenge. Today we have the benefit of incandescent lights and you can see them from great distances, but back then it would have been a difficult thing to see. A painted dial is a dial that you can see very, very easily, and you also have the ability to add color to it. So they caught on very, very quickly and replaced the brass dial probably within a decade's time period. While they're making tall clocks in the late 1700s, early 1800s, the Willard family and some of their competitors are fooling around with a smaller form that we call the Massachusetts shelf clock. And interestingly enough, if a clock's made in Rhode Island and it's in that form, or if it's made in New Hampshire, we still call it a Massachusetts shelf clock. And that's probably the old-timers' homage to Willard's development of that.
Could we see some of those shelf clocks, John?
Absolutely, yeah. So in talking about a Massachusetts shelf clock, this is one of this would be a variation of the form. This particular example was made by Samuel Mulliken, and this would have been made contemporary of a tall case clock. This is an earlier example, and you'll notice that it does have a metal dial. It's actually brass and it's treated with a silver wash. Interestingly enough, this clock here is also made by the same maker, and you can see that it shares a very similar dial. Samuel Mulliken was not only a clockmaker, but he was also an engraver. And these two clocks are thought to have cost about the same amount of money. We know that a clock like this in 1790 cost approximately 2 years' wages for the average laborer working in Boston, which is equivalent to about $30 a year annual income. If you had your choice in 1790 and you had $65 to spend, would you buy a clock that is 7 feet 10 inches tall and approximately 22 inches wide and ran for 8 days, or would you buy something that's about 30 inches tall and much more diminutive in scale? The value for somebody buying perhaps their first clock is really in a tall case clock, and as a result, very few Massachusetts shelf clocks were being produced during that time period. And it's unusual to see a number of them in any one shop. Here we have a number of them to offer.
John, are there any other styles that became popular also in the 18th century or very early 19th century?
Yes, actually, while the Willard family and their competitors were fooling around or developing the Massachusetts shelf clock, that clock really doesn't come into its own until about 1810. During that time period, Simon Willard invents what we call the timepiece, and this is actually what we call a banjo clock today, popularly called a banjo clock. And he gets a patent for this clock in 1802. This clock is revolutionary because it is a much smaller scale. It offers color, meaning éclamosé or reverse painted tablets as a decoration. So again, a lot of color. And it's compact and easy to use, and you can transport it very easily. And these clocks really start to change the way that clockmaking is being not only produced, but are being sold. In Willard's patent, he has 14 years to manufacture this clock exclusively. And over that time, he develops it. And it becomes, at first, it's a very expensive clock. It's about $60. But within 10 or 15 years, it gets down to about $30. And by the end of his patent, at the end of, let's say around 1820, so it becomes a $10 clock, roughly a $10 clock. And as a result, the number of orders for this type of clock increases dramatically over the very expensive tall case clock. And in New England, these clocks they say fall out of favor, but it's because they're so expensive. It's not that people didn't want them. It's just that you had the opportunity to buy a clock that was so much less expensive. And these clockmakers making clocks by hand become consumed with making clocks like this for their clientele.
Are there any other periods that we ought to cover at all?
Well, there are variations of this. I mean, because of the patent, you see the New Hampshire mirror clock being developed in New Hampshire, but in reality, it's just a different case or a different piece of furniture around this movement. This movement being compact, weight-driven. Of course, the competitors are always going to look for a way of getting around that patent. So there are variants, but this is the form that really takes hold. The Willards are very successful as clockmakers. They're probably the first people ever manufacture clocks on speculation. And they probably had a showroom right on Roxbury's or Washington Street in Boston, in Roxbury. We know that they employed sales agents to sell these clocks for them outside of Roxbury. And as a result, Simon Willard's taking these clocks and he's using David Wood as a sales agent in the North Shore. He's got sales agents down in Rhode Island, and they're selling these clocks on his behalf. So again, the world changes very, very quickly with the development of this clock.
This does not appear to be able to chime. It only has the one keyhole, is that right?
That's right. So these are first developed as timepieces, and a timepiece means that it just keeps time. It has a single train. Of course, there are no set rules in clockmaking. If you wanted it, it was a custom order thing for the most part. They would build you what you wanted. They offered strike trains in them at a later period of time. They also offered alarms. There's a lot of variations in clocks in general, not just banjo clocks, but also in tall clocks. There are very rarely do you see two clocks that are identical.
Okay, what's the next? Going through the progression, what would be next?
So after the banjo clock, the next progression is really Eli Terry's development of an affordable clock for the mass population. And Eli Terry should really be given credit for the first person to ever manufacture an item with interchangeable parts. And this is a good representation of that type of clock. We call it a pillar and scroll clock today. And he first introduces it probably about 1815. This is a clock that actually has wooden gearing. After the War of 1812, the British weren't too enthusiastic about selling us brass because we just beat them in the war for the second time. And as a result, we used the material in which we had lots of, and that was wood. And Terry was an ingenious person. He set up a factory and built clocks in batches. And in theory, you could take, if you have a Model 5 pillar and scroll, you could take two Model 5s and interchange the gears and the clock would work. So it was really a revolutionary design. And of course, because they're being mass produced, the prices of these clocks come down substantially. And by 1825, you can buy a clock like this for what's thought for about $5 or $6 in New England. These clocks are sold by peddlers, which means that a person would come to Terry's factory and they may take as many as whatever they could carry, 5 or 6, maybe 20 clocks, and they go off in the countryside, set them up in homes and try to sell them one by one. So we haven't gotten to the department store yet, but we have these people that are going through the neighborhoods and selling things like this. And their numbers of clocks that they're manufacturing are significant. We've gone from what is thought to take about a month to create a single tall clock to probably making some in the neighborhood of thousands of clocks annually in this format.
Where were the Terrys located?
The Terrys were located in Connecticut, Bristol, Connecticut, and that becomes the center for American-made manufactured clocks. By the 1880s, what were hundreds of clockmakers eventually turns into 7 very big shops. And some of the names that you hear frequently are the Seth Thomas Clock Company, the Waterbury Clock Company, certainly Ansonia Clock Company, and there are several others. But they become the suppliers of inexpensive time all over the world. And not only inexpensive clock, they made some really great things too, but we really supplied inexpensive clocks to anybody that was looking for that type of item.
Are there any other time periods we ought to cover?
Well, I think we've gone naturally from making clocks in a cottage industry by yourself under candlelight, and then sort of progressing into what the Willards were doing, where they had a number of apprentices working for them, and they had the outputs that was significant. They were probably selling hundreds of clocks a year. And then the Terry, and then after his group, where they're manufacturing and selling thousands of clocks a year. And by the time the 1880s come about, Seth Thomas Clock Company was probably producing several 100,000 clocks annually.
John, you've mentioned New England several times. Did all of these clocks stay in New England, or did they range throughout the country, or the colonies anyway?
Yeah, there was a number of clockmakers that sold clocks, what we consider the South, and if you're from New England, you consider anything south of Pennsylvania the South. Specifically, or especially true in clockmaking. There were a number of clockmakers who were certainly producing things with the idea of sending them down into that area. And this is a good example. This is actually a clock that is signed Samuel and Keplinger, Baltimore, Maryland. The reality is that this clock was probably made in Boston for that market. And Keplinger probably advertised or told his customer that he could get something from Boston that was of the latest fashion, and this is certainly a good example of that. This is a mahogany case. It has Boston proportions. It's a little bit oversized as what you expect to see in Boston, because typically the ceiling heights aren't as tall as you would find in the southern states. And as a result, this clock is built to scale. When you were buying a clock like this, you pretty much bought a clock that fit the ceiling height of your room. If you had an 8-foot ceiling, you probably bought a clock that was 7'10". If you had 9-foot ceilings, well, then you wanted a clock that was probably 8'6". And there's a limit to the height because you have to be able to reach up and wind it. So you wouldn't want, if you had 10-foot ceilings, you wouldn't want a 9-foot clock because you'd have to get a ladder out every time. But this would make sense. So as a result, a person of average height could reach this clock, but it still has the vertical height that makes it very impressive in someone's home. There are a number of makers that did that, that catered to those markets. Certainly the Monroes did that from Concord. The Baileys did a nice business sending clocks south. And then of course, as the evolution of clocks and the periods change, the Wooden Works clocks were being sold down in the south, where they were not received so well at first, and some of the factories down there, or some of the factories in Connecticut, had to set up assembling factories down in the south so that they could consider them southern-made clocks. In reality, they were made in Connecticut.
Now the fretwork on that clock looks Roxbury, Boston. Is that accurate or not?
Yes, it is. The fretwork feature that you mentioned on top of the case is really a New England feature. You don't see it very much south of Connecticut. So that's another indication of a case form. When you see that type of fretwork, it's a good chance it was made in either Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, or Maine. And it became very popular again because of the Willard influence in selling clocks. They were very, very successful. A point that I like to make is that if it's thought that Aaron Willard and Simon Willard probably combined in selling about 6,000 clocks in their business life cycle. The most prolific clockmaker during roughly the same period of time was Daniel Burnap, and his shop records exist. We know he made about 100 tall clocks in his lifetime. So 6,000 clocks versus 100, the Willards were really doing things right. So this is
what business skills did the Willards have in manufacturing, sales, marketing, all of those kind of things? What made them so much more successful?
That's a great question. It's got many parts to it. The Willards started like most clockmakers. They started on a farm in Grafton, and they were manufacturing probably their first group of clocks for their oldest brother, Benjamin. Benjamin was 10 years older than Simon, and first traveled to Connecticut to learn wooden geared clockmaking, but then when came back, he actually came back to Grafton. He probably realized very quickly that brass clocks were more profitable and easier to sell. And as a result, he goes to Lexington and learns clockmaking from Nathaniel Mulliken. He stays there for a little bit of period of time and then moves to Roxbury and sets up a shop. And his output's pretty significant. A lot of people overlook Benjamin Willard, but the number of clocks that he produces suggests that he has other people that are helping him make clocks. And this is part of what's called an apprentice system. And he advertises that he has workmen back in Grafton. And we speculate that Simon, Aaron, Ephraim, and maybe a couple of other people are making clocks that Benjamin is signing on the dial as being his own. Simon and Aaron Willard come of age. They move from Grafton to Roxbury, and that's really where they get their start as being very successful clockmakers. At the time, if you wanted to travel in and out of Boston, you had to go in and out on Washington Street. Boston looked much different then than it does today. It was a single road that went in and out, and it's thought that Willard's shop was right on that street, and they were probably the first people to build clocks on speculation, which meant that they actually had a shop not only to manufacture clocks, but also had clocks for sale. So if you were a businessman and you were traveling in and out of Boston and hopefully had a pocket full of money from selling your goods that went overseas somewhere or to other parts of the colonies, when you came out, you could buy a ready-made product from the Willards, probably from a selection of a few, maybe a dozen we'd like to fantasize about. And you could take those clocks home with you. You didn't necessarily have to order one, so instant gratification. And the Willards at that point started training a number of apprentices that were helping them produce. We like to say feeding the machine. They become so successful that a number of artisans start to move into the area. Case makers, brass mongers, dial painters, all settle in this artisan village of Roxbury to help support the Willard success in manufacturing clocks like this. And many of those apprentices, once they've come of age, they start to go to other parts of New England and become very successful clockmakers in their own right. Names like Levi and Abel Hutchins, certainly. And in Boston, L. Nathan Tabor, William Cummins actually stay in Roxbury and continue to make clocks for themselves and probably also for the Willards. They trained Daniel Monroe, who goes off to Concord and becomes very successful, and then comes back to Boston, Massachusetts, and I speculate that he probably was working as a journeyman for Willards because the number of clocks they needed to produce was so significant. And we see this time and time again with the number of people that were working there. There are advertisements where people speculate that Aaron Willard had as many as 30 people working for him at one time. Within 10 years, Aaron Willard buys a piece of property in Boston, which is just over the Roxbury line. It's probably less than 5,000 yards or 3,000 yards away. And in this building that he builds, it's called the compound in our clock world. He rents out rooms or stalls to other artisans. So it's gone from having to go next door to visit a case maker to having a case maker actually on the property that's renting a room from him. And everything that is needed to construct a clock is now under essentially this one building that Aaron Willard owns, again called the compound. And during the production of tall clocks, he could simply just walk down the hallway and say, you know, hey William, I need a case from you today that's such and such tall, and he would begin to construct it, and he'd have his apprentices working on movements, and he'd have dial painters or ornamental artists working in the same building, and everything could come together under the same roof. And it's much different than what happens with Terry, where it's a factory setting and everything's being produced in batches. Here he has much like a group antique shop of the 1990s and early 2000s, where they were renting space or stalls to multiple dealers. He was renting spots to multiple artisans. Again, clocks being built on speculation. We see evidence of sales agents, and they're sending things down to the southern parts of the colonies, and business is really good. But the evolution of the product changes from tall clock to, in the occasional shelf clock, to the banjo clock. And then by the time the 1820s or 30s come around, they have a very difficult time competing with what's being produced in Connecticut. And as a result, the hand manufacturing age starts to go away.
And listening to you, John, it sounds like generally the movement, the mechanism is created and that person's name goes on the dial. How do we know who the case makers are?
In many instances, we don't. In many instances, we don't know who actually manufactured the cases. A lot of those cabinet makers are really not known. They didn't typically sign their work, and as a result, after looking at many clocks, we can see a pattern, but for the most part, most case makers are unidentifiable. There is a rare instance where you do know who manufactured a case, and that is usually as a result of finding one that is signed somewhere and applying the characteristics of that case to others that are similar to it. For example, this particular case was probably was made by Stephen Badlam. Stephen Badlam was a Dorchester cabinet maker and operated a very big shop, and we know that the Willards patronized that shop, as well as some of their competitors like L. Nathan Tabor, or I guess you could say that Tabor is a competitor, yeah. This case is very distinctive in its inlay format. You'll notice that the quarter fans here are not in the door, they're actually in part of the frame. And Badlam's really the only person known to have done that. You'll also notice that the complex work of the inlays are very unusual as compared to some of the other more standard versions of case. So a clock like this was probably a special order. Somebody who wanted something that was really over the top in terms of its presentation. Another feature here is this blind fretwork. You don't typically see this. Typically you see this arch molding down above this arched bonnet door. So this would have been an extra bit of work, and as a result would have been more expensive than your standard example. Some of the more famous case makers that the Willards patronized were certainly the Badlam shop. There was also the Seymour shop, and then they had a number of cabinet makers that are listed in ads that they worked with, like William Fisk. One worth noting is that Aaron Willard had a son, Henry Willard, and we know that Henry Willard made a number of clocks for his father once he comes of age. So most of those clocks or clock cases that you find that are attributed to him will be very late, probably in the 1810 or later period. And again, New England clockmaking for tall case clock pretty much ends about 1815 or 1820. So the number of clocks that you'll find made by Henry Willard, or clock cabinets that are made by Henry Willard, will be pretty small as compared to the overall production.
Okay, it sounds to me, John, like a lot of the case makers were also making furniture. You mentioned the Seymours in Boston. They made a lot of furniture. So how does the case follow furniture design, or does it?
It most certainly does. You remember one of the first clocks that we talked about in the beginning was the Cheney, and I mentioned that it had some very Queen Anne features. Very big moldings, broad moldings, a completely different look as to what was made after the Revolution. This is an example of a Henry Willard case, again a very late case, and when we're talking about Roxbury clocks, we've lost a lot of the details that make some of the early Roxbury clocks so recognizable. Here we have just simple turned columns. We've lost the brass stop fluting decoration. This clock stands on what are called flared French feet. So the progression of feet would be a bracket foot or a flat base molding across the bottom that would rest on flat on the floor. Then as periods change, it starts to elevate a little bit. Then we go to what's called an ogee bracket foot, and then a variation of this flared French foot. So this is really the last of what you'll see in New England clockmaking. In Pennsylvania, where the production of clocks is a little bit, has more of a lag to it. Some of the Pennsylvania clocks end up on turned feet, which would be really the last of the elevated foot. I mean, it's a little too late for what you see being produced in New England. Here we have a dial that's reminiscent of a Massachusetts shelf clock dial made about 1820 or 25. And you'll notice that here we have painted decoration, much like the shelf clocks and the banjo clocks. So again, signifying a very late tall case clock. If we jump 50 years, here we have a clock you can see has very Victorian features. This clock was made by the E. Howard Clock Company in Boston. Edward Howard was a Willard apprentice, and this is a factory-made clock. So he had a big factory actually located in Roxbury, and he made clocks in a factory setting. The features of this with the applied carvings, still maintains a finial, the fans, very Victorian presentation. And of course that was the style for the period, and as a result, if you wanted to sell the latest and the greatest, you had to be in the latest and greatest company.
John, this Howard clock that we're looking at has a lot more glass than the early ones so that you can see the pendulum. What's the story with that?
That's actually a stylistic change in tall case clocks. After they stopped making them in New England, the companies don't start to manufacture tall case clocks again until about the 1890s or so. And as a result, a stylistic change is to add glass in the door. And then you finish the inside of the case. In a typical colonial clock, if you open the door, the case is not finished inside. You might have a brass face bob, but the pendulum is just either a plain wood rod or a metal rod. There's no decoration to it. And the weights are often either just lead or tin cans. They really didn't spend a lot of time on finishing it. In the Victorian times, where you start to see glass used, you need to finish the back of the case. You make the pendulum more presentable, and the weights are usually sleeved in brass. So there's a big change. If you see a tall case clock with a glass door, a full glass door, it's a good indication that it's a very late clock, probably made around 1900 or later.
John, we've done a lot with the cases and these beautiful decorations and so forth, but it's a clock. What makes it work?
Well, your standard colonial tall case clock has a brass 8-day movement. Okay? 2 brass plates frame the mechanism. Steel arbors cross those plates.
What's an arbor?
An arbor is a steel shaft that supports a gear. In your standard timepiece, you need 4 gears in order to gear it for an 8-day clock. Okay? This is a good example of a tall case clock, probably made about 1810. It is a timing strike example, and you can see the gearing inside is framed by the plates. The standard format is that this will run 8 days, and it's powered by 2 drive weights. A drive weight for the time train and a drive weight for the strike train. And typically those weights vary anywhere between 8 or 13 pounds a piece, depending on the mechanism. This clock needs to be wound once a week. The other alternative to a brass movement clock is a wooden geared clock. And these were made in the colonies in quantity after about 1790. And why would you use wood? Well, brass again was the most expensive material in manufacturing a clock, and it didn't have access to brass, then you needed a material that you could find in quantity. And in New England, it was wood. All of the gearing in this clock is constructed from wood, even the arbors that support the gearing. The plates in this clock are actually maple, and this clock was made in Sunapee, New Hampshire, a village called Wendell, about 1795, 1800. Now, in wooden geared clockmaking, there are pockets in which they were very popular. Ashby, Massachusetts, there were a group of clockmakers. The family name was Edwards, and another family name of Willard, distantly related to the Willards of Boston. They made a significant number of clocks, and they also trained a fair number of other clockmakers who went off to other parts of rural New England and manufactured wooden geared clocks. It's thought that when you bought a wooden geared clock, it was sold by a peddler, and he brought you the mechanism, the dial, the weights, and the pendulum, and then you would have the case made locally because it was too difficult to transport. So the peddler didn't take 5 complete tall clocks with him. He took 5 complete tall clock setups. And in the Connecticut business model, if they could sell enough of these clock setups in a specific neighborhood, he might promise that he could send out a cabinet maker to build clocks at a later time. These were much less expensive than the brass versions, and they took far less time to manufacture. Now, the disadvantage of a wooden geared clock is that wood is still a medium that accepts moisture. So at a hot, humid day in New England, a clock like this may actually swell and bind. And there's really nothing you can do about it until that humidity leaves the region. There was a bigger problem 30 years ago. With the advent of air conditioning and central heating, most people who buy wooden geared clocks put them in an environment that's much more stable, and as a result, the humidity is not as much of an issue. You can get a wooden geared clock to run in a climate controlled setting. It should run as well as it was designed to do the full year. When we sell a wooden geared clock today, we like to tell people that they run 300 days out of the year. There's a period of time where they just won't operate. Not all of them, but a vast majority of them.
So a brass geared clock is going to be much more popular in the 18th century in Charleston, South Carolina, than a wooden works clock.
Even today, yeah. Finding people who are willing to wind a clock daily, this is a 30-hour, wooden geared clock is a 30-hour clock. You have to wind it every day, as opposed to once a week, really keeps the prices down of wooden geared clocks. They're much more difficult to sell. They're sold more as a piece of furniture as opposed to a timepiece. You can regulate your life by a brass works clock. They're very good timekeepers.
Speaking of Charleston, South Carolina, were they sending the case and the clock south, or were a number of people sending just the works, just the mechanism?
That's a good question. I think that from my perspective, most of what's being sent down there is a complete clock. I'm sure there are instances where just the mechanism is going down, but if you could afford to have a clock bought from New England, you probably could afford to buy the whole thing.
And also in the case of the brass gears, were they, some of those coming from Europe, finished or unfinished, or what's the history on that?
That's a real interesting subject right now. There are a couple of different camps in the way that people think about that. I'm of the opinion that if you're a Willard and you have multiple apprentices working for you, you're probably building your own product. There are certainly examples of components being sent here from England specifically, that the Willards, during the period in which the Willards worked, that they were probably finishing, not completely manufacturing, but it was probably because it was a time issue. They needed to produce so many things. It's my contention that most of the clocks that were made in New England, specifically, were made by New England clock makers. As you move into the 1820s or 30s, there are records of complete movements being sold to the Americas, but most of those are being sold down in the Pennsylvania area to the south. And as a result, you're more apt to find an English-made movement down there than you are in New England. So it really has to do with timing more than anything else.
John, as we've gone around this incredible shop, there are more choices than I can imagine. What do you see when you're coming in to buy a clock? What should people be looking for?
It's my experience that when people come here for the first time, they're a little overwhelmed. Some of the things that people should think about when they're looking for a clock is you should always buy a clock that appeals to your eye. The person who's buying the clock is the person who's going to live with the clock, and as a result, they should consider it a beautiful clock. Of course, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So what I think is pretty is not necessarily important to you. It's my job to sort of guide you, to educate you on the type of clock that you're picking, so that you know or have confidence that you're buying something of good value and it's a good quality product, all of which these are. The standard or the catchphrase that my father's been saying for 50 years is, a rare ugly clock will always be a rare ugly clock. And you're going to live with it, so buy something that you really like. Some of the things to consider are people can make a definitive decision whether they prefer, we talked about the brass dial versus the painted dial. Color, certainly height is a big consideration. And if you have 8-foot ceilings, you don't want to consider a clock that's 9 feet tall. If you have 9-foot ceilings, you don't want to buy a clock that's 7 feet tall. You want it to fit the space. And again, these were originally built to fit the space. Cabinet from cabinets, you have light colors and dark colors, you have carved features, you have inlay features. That's all personal preference, and it's up to you to sort of get a handle on what you prefer best. It's an individual process. You never know. I never know when somebody walks through the door which clock I'm going to sell next, because I don't know what their particular tastes are at that particular time.
What's the future? As an antique collector, what's the future in collecting clocks?
That's the $100 question today. We have seen a big recession in collecting antiques in general. Right now we're buying clocks for less money than we were paying for them in my father was paying for them in the 1970s. We think that clocks and antique furniture in general is a tremendous value, and this is a tremendous buying opportunity. I think that it has in the past has skipped a generation or two and has become popular again. We certainly saw that a big increase in popularity after they redecorated the White House in the 60s, and hopefully something will shift where things like this will become very popular once again.
John, as we look at this incredible variety of clocks that you have here, I don't know how anybody couldn't find something that they love. I just noticed as we came over here, here's one from London with an enamel dial. We haven't even scratched the surface on dials, much less everything else. I can't thank you enough for all your knowledge and your incredible display. Thanks very, very much again.
I really appreciate the opportunity to walk through the shop. It was very nice of you to come. If you have any questions, or maybe we can do this again sometime. This was really a lot of fun. Thank you.
Okay, it sure was a great deal of fun.